In today's day and age, we need to save. We need to invest wisely. I was listening to this show on NPR a couple weeks ago, and it was a show aimed towards young adults. It was about money management. And they were talking about all the different sort of ways that young adults can save. They were tossing around terms like equity and long-term investments and low risks. And the experts, they took a few phone calls from young adults. And these so-called experts had this sound advice to offer. And I remember one phone call in particular. A young woman called up and said, I am 22 and I have come into $10,000 and I was wondering where I should put my money. And so these so-called experts talked among themselves and they came back and they said something like this. All right, try to follow. Depending on where the market is right now, you should invest all of your money in stocks or bonds right now. That is if the market is low. Or you should put all your money in stocks and bonds, spread it out over equal payments over the next 12 months. That is if the market is high, in hopes that the market might go down. Now, God bless you if you understood anything I just said. I'm not entirely sure myself that I understood what I have just said. You see, I don't have a degree in business or in finance. I took one class on economics in college. It was a macroeconomics class. We learned the finer details of Keynesian economics. So I can tell you what economic policy looks like from afar, from above. But when it comes to personal finance, well, that's another story. However, I can understand why a 22-year-old who desires to invest some money wisely now so that she can accumulate interest and wealth over her lifetime. So with hard work and discipline by the time that she is retirement age, she will be doing just fine if she invests wisely and works hard, at least as it pertains to wealth. So the question is, what sort of economics should Christians be emulating? Is it something like this 22-year-old who calls up and wants to invest wisely 10 grand? Now I think there is some sort of precedent for this sort of model. Now remember the book of Genesis. Remember Joseph? Joseph, the younger brother, Joseph of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers because they were jealous of his love between him and his father Joseph. Remember this Joseph, right? So Joseph, having been sold into slavery in Egypt, is found to have this gift of being able to interpret dreams. And the Pharaoh comes to him and says, I heard you can interpret dreams. And Joseph said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And Pharaoh says, I have this dream. And he explains this weird dream. I don't remember what it was. But Joseph said, all right, here's the dream. Egypt is going to have 7 years of abundance. They're going to have crops and grain, a great harvest. And then they're going to have 7 years of famine, drought. And so Joseph said, here's what I advise. Work real hard, save your stuff, invest wisely in storing your goods and your food, and then after 7 years, you will have food to eat during the famine. And so the Pharaoh did just that, and Joseph rose to prominence, and everything was well. And that seems like good, sound advice. Joseph seems to be saying to Pharaoh and to us maybe, work hard, invest now, because one day there will be a time when you do not have an income from work, and you will need to be able to provide for your family, for food, for shelter, for the things that you need. Now, is this the sort of advice that we should be following? Is there another model? There is. To answer your question, there is. So we look at someone like St. Francis of Assisi. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with this guy, I'll give you a brief summary. St. Francis of Assisi was an Italian who lived around the turn of the 12th century. And he came from a lot of money. He came from wealth. And he lived up the high life, partied and had a really good time. But somewhere along the line, he went through a transformation, and he wanted to follow Jesus more closely. So one day he decided to take off all his clothes and give it to a leper in the street. And he abdicated his family's wealth and fortune and became a monk. He started an order called the Franciscans. And he remains to this day one of the most beloved of all Catholic saints in Roman Catholicism. Now, he gave up all his wealth and his possessions, and he took a vow of poverty. Now, we could say, in a different way, that St. Francis invested wisely, he worked hard, but he did not work to accumulate wealth so that he could retire comfortably. He invested not in stocks or bonds, but in relationships with people, and in particular with God. Now, there's a caveat. He died around age 43 in absolute poverty. Go do likewise. Just kidding. Don't do that. Now, is St. Francis, is he the sort of model that we should be following? Is he the sort of disciple that we should emulate? Now, today is the last Sunday in our sermon series on discipleship. Discipleship being defined as following Jesus, doing the sort of things that he taught us to do, living the sort of lives that he is asking us to live. That is discipleship. The scripture for today comes from the Gospel of Luke, and Jesus is once again showing us and is telling us through a parable a little bit more about following Jesus. So in the scripture for today, Jesus is talking to a crowd, and someone comes up to him, and this someone practically demands of Jesus, saying, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now, in that time period, it was customary for the oldest brother to inherit 2/3 of his family's wealth, and the younger brothers to divide it into 1/3 among themselves. However, since most people in the time of Jesus living in his area of the world were poor, they had no land or wealth or possessions to pass on. So this someone, he's just described as someone, this someone who comes up to Jesus already comes from a considerable amount of wealth and means. Now maybe this brother, maybe he's not feeling that he's being treated fairly by his brother. Maybe this brother feels that he does not have enough. Maybe this brother feels that if he just gets a little bit more of this brother's 2/3 wealth, that he would be doing just fine when it comes time to retirement. And here's what Jesus said to him. "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbiter over you?" Jesus is telling him he is not going to enter into a dispute about his brother and his brother's inheritance. He then turns to the crowd and he says, "Take care, be on guard against all kinds of greed, for your life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Well said, Jesus. Well said. This saying makes a lot of sense to someone like St. Francis of Assisi, whose life not consisted in any abundance at all, any possessions at all. And it makes a lot of sense that Jesus would make this statement to this brother in a dispute about family inheritance. You see, the world of Jesus was a world of poverty, where if someone like the brother got rich, it was probably off the backs of those less fortunate than him. But if you live in today's day and age, and you are 22 or 32 or 42 and on, we also learn from scriptures that it is wise to invest our talents and our resources wisely. It is wise to plan for the times when we do not have income from work to pay for our food, for our homes, or for our well-being. So we have two options, it seems. And the first option, we just accumulate wealth and possessions so that we can live comfortably when we no longer work. Is this the option where we sell everything we have That's the other option. Is there the option where we sell everything we have, where we accumulate no possessions, and we live a life of poverty like St. Francis of Assisi? Those seem to be two extreme options. Options of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. Now, some churches throughout the world have done quite well with the first option. It's called the health and wealth gospel. It is a theology based upon the premise that if you pray hard enough and you believe hard enough and you give lots of money to that particular church, that God will bless you with lots of money. Actual money. Now, this is not a biblically sound or theologically rigorous premise. Health and wealth theology is not really found in Scripture, and it is not what our tradition affirms. I can see why it is popular, though. Just pray hard enough, believe hard enough, and God will give you money. It sounds too good to be true. But what we have discovered is that the pastor, he gets really rich. It's not our thing here. Not our thing. Now, there is a stronger foundation for option number 2. There are examples in the book of Acts where the earliest Christians sell all their possessions and they have a common purse and they live lives of simplicity. And of course, there is the example of Jesus, who he did not have a lot of things, and he lived a nomadic life, wandering from town to town, preaching the gospel. Now, the second option is appealing to a lot of young Christians in the United States. There are more than a few examples of what is called new monasticism in our country. Here, communities of young Christians have gathered and lived in intentional communities. They share their resources and their possessions, and they hope to be prophetic witnesses of the gospel in cities and towns in which they are living. Is this option, this new monasticism, is this the sort of model that we Christians should be following as disciples of Jesus? I think that this is a great model, and definitely more in line with what Jesus is teaching than the gospel of health and wealth. Yet, is this what Jesus is asking us to do? To live like St. Francis of Assisi? Or these young Christians in their new monastic communities? There's more in today's scripture. Jesus goes on with a parable, something like this. So there was a rich man who had been blessed with a really good harvest. He owned land, which was not the norm for most people in this day and age. And this rich man, he produced so many crops that he did not have enough room to store them. Now, we would believe that God blessed him abundantly, right? So this rich man, he comes up with a plan. He already has barns to store his crops, but he thinks to himself, I will tear down these barns and build bigger barns so that I can store all the harvest of grains and crops that I have that I grew this year. So the rich man, he thinks highly of this plan, and he tells himself, you will not have to work anymore. Soul, he tells the soul, you have saved up enough. So now you can relax, eat, drink, and be merry. That sounds like a really good retirement plan to me. Save, work hard, at the end of your days, eat, drink, and be merry. What's not to like? However, Jesus goes on with the parable. God says to the rich man, using these words, you fool! This very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? The end of the parable. Jesus goes on to say, this man is going to die, and he will have to face God, and what will happen to his crops and the grain that he stored? They will not go with him. Jesus ends with this to the crowd. This is the fate of those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. That is the key phrase, are not rich toward God. What are some of the things that this rich man could have done with the extra abundance of crops and grains? One, he could have acknowledged that his abundance came from God's blessing. Two, he could have sold his crops, provided economic well-being for his neighbors. 3, he could have shared with those who did not have money to pay for it so that others could be fed.